Emily Mackenzie, thank you very much for this thought-provoking presentation. We will continue our conference with a panel discussion, for which I would like to call the moderator of the panel discussion to the stage, Ms. Helena Naffa, Associate Professor and Director of the Sustainable Finance Research Center at Corvinus University of Budapest. And please also welcome our speakers, Mr. Gábor Gyura, Advisor at UNEP, Mr. Guan Schellekens, Team Lead of the Climate Risk Project Management Office of the European Central Bank. Ms. Ingrid Kukuljan, Head of Impact and Sustainable Investing at Federated Hermes. And Mr. Giovanni Garcea, Team Leader for Green Finance at the Directorate General for Environment of the European Commission. During the panel discussion, the audience is provided with the possibility to ask questions using the QR code.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and I'm very humbled to be joined by a team of experts who are working at the intersection of biodiversity and finance. A few years ago, we might not have imagined that this niche term would become the main topic of a conference at the central bank. But today, we are here with key stakeholders representing very different insights, and I'm interested to hear from you. So perhaps you could please start with introducing yourselves, and what do you see from your own positions? What are you doing in terms of having financial markets as indirect drivers of nature-related risks? How can they be integrated, and how can we advance this effort forward? So let me start with you, Guan, please.
Thanks a lot, Helena, and good afternoon, everyone. Pleasure to be here. So thanks for the introduction already before. So I'm working indeed in the European Central Bank on the banking supervision arm. And before that, I in fact had the pleasure of working at the Dutch Central Bank on nature-related risks as well. I saw one of the early reports that we did there, also listed in the previous presentation. So what are we doing in the European Central Bank on this? As you are probably aware, we are the supervisor of the 110 largest institutions in the euro area. And back in 2020 already, we set out our expectations on climate-related and environmental risk, and nature-related risks, if you will. So already acknowledging at that time the importance of also covering that in the way we execute our prudential supervision. And what's important to mention there is that, of course, as a citizen of Europe, I'm very interested in scaling up biodiversity finance, but as a prudential supervisor, I'm interested in the way institutions, so banks under our supervision, manage the risks associated with nature degradation. And there, as we already heard in previous panels, there's a lot of reason to be concerned about that. So IPBES, of course, setting out clearly the loss of ecosystem services. We know from some of our own research work that in the range of 70% of financing of banks under our supervision is highly or very highly dependent on at least one ecosystem services. So that's also the reason that we, as a supervisor, prioritized climate-related and nature-related risk already a couple of years ago and set out a multi-year program to foster banks' alignment with our expectations. So we started with several reviews already in 2021, and as you might know, we have set deadlines for all banks under our supervision to meet our expectations by the end of 2024 at the latest. So I'll talk a little bit about, in the rest of the panel, what we're already observing now, but of course, the main milestone still to be achieved. And maybe one last comment on how we go about that. It's a bit of a story of the carrot and the stick, if you will. So we have announced in 2022 that we do expect all institutions to meet all of our expectations, and that we would use enforcement instruments if that is necessary. So if we really see foundational aspects missing in the risk management of banks, that we would also use the supervisory toolkit at our disposal. And the other part of the story is the carrot, if you will. We know, of course, that especially for nature-related risk, this is very much under development. So we are also committed to publish good practices, updates whenever we see them. So if we see good ways to manage these risks, we also share them, and we have committed to do that again also next year. So.
Okay. And Ingrid, turning to you, you're representing one of the largest investors and one of the most dedicated ones to this topic, so perhaps you can share your insights with us.
Sure. So Federated Hermes is a US/UK-based asset manager. We are known as leaders in responsible investment. We have 800 billion of assets under management, but we also advise on about 2 trillion of assets under management. And why this is important is that we represent some of the largest asset owners globally, and nature is one of our priorities. We have set out something called Nature Net Zero by 2030, where we are engaging with corporates and asking them to set targets and helping them in their transition to sustainability. We have been working on biodiversity for the past 5 years. We are members of, actually co-chairs of Finance for Biodiversity Foundation, so we were directly involved in the negotiations during Montreal COP and during the Cali COP. I'm part of the International Advisory Panel on Biodiversity Credits, and I believe it's, in terms of the innovative financial mechanisms, it's a huge step forward, especially to address issues on a local level. Why it's important to actually engage with corporates and public companies is that if you look at the nature destruction, the major culprits are actually the large public multinationals. So 3 years ago, we set up a fund in collaboration with the Natural History Museum of London. And when I initially started thinking about this fund, my first thought was a transition fund. But then we looked at the data and we realized, given that literally every single company needs to transition globally, we will try and really find which companies are biodiversity champions. So we put 2 main criteria to this. One criteria was that a company needs to align with at least one UN SDG. The reason for this is, we are all reading reports of, only 16% of UN SDGs have been achieved. The main reason for this is that 80% of the SDGs depend on biodiversity. Given that we haven't been taking care of biodiversity, it's very difficult to see how we will achieve the UN SDG targets. And the second one is that the company needs to help preserve or restore biodiversity. So to give you some data, we came out with a list of only 150 companies out of the 9,000 that are part of the index. And the work that we did with the scientists was to ensure that we moved the capital flows in that direction. Apart from that, we are also members of the Nature Action 100 initiatives, and we do a lot of collaborative engagement as a part of the finance industry.
And maybe turning to you, Giovanni.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot for the invitation, first of all. It's a real pleasure to be here. So I'm Giovanni Garcea. I'm working in the European Commission in the Directorate General for Environment. My role is basically to coordinate the inputs of colleagues who are more technical expert on the, let's say, green aspects, and feed that into the work of the colleagues doing the financial services regulation under the sustainable finance agenda. So I think the main point I wanted to make today was already been made by a lot of speakers about whether this is serious and whether we need to act. so I'm very happy I don't need to repeat that one. What I would like to add to this as a first point is that we also produced a study this spring. So the European Commission asked an external contractor to develop a methodological framework to assess the potential financial risks due to biodiversity losses. The framework is very much aligned and complementary to the ones that we just heard from TNFD, but also on the one from the OECD and the Hungarian Central Bank that we will hear later, as well as the ones developed by the NGFS framework of the central banks. The aim is to answer the question, so we understand the risks are there is exposure, but how this transmits to the financial sector. So how financial institutions are exposed, what is the financial impact for them? So maybe without going into the details of the study itself, but it follows the logic also described in the TNFD presentation earlier, where you first need to scope and define which is the perimeter of the assessment you want to perform, then to quantify the risks, both from a physical and from a transitional aspects, then calculate the exposure at a company level, and finally quantify the financial impact. So ultimately the idea is to help the financial sector to give the tools to start doing these assessments and start to quantify the financial risks. Thank you.
Thank you. And let me turn to Gábor. And I think with the introduction, we must add that you are also a founding member of the Hungarian Sustainable Investment Forum. So with that and with your advisory to UNEP-FI, I'm interested to hear your thoughts from your position, what you're doing to drive biodiversity finance.
Thanks. And indeed, I really hope that also the Hungarian investment industry can also contribute to all these biodiversity objectives. But maybe in this panel, I will rather talk about what I'm doing for UNEP. So being a former central banker, I also completely agree with the seriousness of the, let's say, financial risk angle. This is really a risk for the individual banks, and also there are probably macroprudential systemic implications. But for UNEP, our angle is, of course, slightly different. Our mandate is not about financial stability, but how can we support banks, especially in emerging markets, to contribute better to the objectives of the global biodiversity framework, which, well, basically our main message is that this is something very, very comparable to the Paris Climate Agreement, but it is already, I think, a very complex message, because it's fairly, I think, easy to translate the Paris Climate Agreement to, let's say, quantitative targets, scenarios, decarbonization targets, and so on. But the global biodiversity framework itself is so much complex. But the good news is that my experience working with banks in many continents, especially outside Europe, that they are absolutely interested. It really has been on the agenda for many banks, especially in Latin America. I think many banks are even much more advanced than some of the, especially the Eastern European banks. This is good news. I also think that what central banks do matter a lot. So probably this is the most important convening power nowadays, that, well, central banks are turning to the topic. They are issuing new kinds of expectations, guidances. Okay, so we also must take it seriously. However, and this is how I would like to close my introduction, we also would like to raise the bar even further. Okay, how can we make sure that these banks actually support stopping nature loss, like regenerating nature? And this is, for a bank, a very, very, let's say, challenging topic, and maybe we can get into that later.
Well, thank you very much. And we see that we have very different perspectives here with us, and it's always a debate between regulators and market players pointing at each other. So I'm interested to hear from you. What do you see as key trends here, and what are the key challenges that you see? Let me start with you, Guan.
With great pleasure, of course. And I think the first observation is, of course, that we are lagging behind climate-related risk management, right? So we also, in our reviews, have looked at both dimensions at every turn. And in 2022, we also saw that at that point, 40% of the banks under our supervision did not even look at nature-related risks at all in terms of even assessing how they could be exposed to the risk, right? So that was clearly a disappointing result. And as one of our board members has put it, the glass wasn't even half full; it was just starting to fill up. So we really see a big gap, if you will, between the risk perceptions that we also just saw on the slides of Emily. If you ask CEOs of large firms, what do you think the main risks are? You see all of the nature-related risk popping up right at the top. But if you look at the risk management capabilities that you actually see on the ground, there seems to be still quite a significant gap. Now, that was 2022. So we issued, of course, our expectations. We asked institutions to further develop that, and we do now see very significant improvements taking place on the ground. So we really see this starting to trickle down both at the kind of strategy dimension and the risk management dimension, right? So in strategy, where I think typically institutions would be inclined to start just with excluding certain activities, but you see now also that there's a lot more activity in, clarifying in sector policies what we want to see, what the right approaches are, if you will, and also using client engagement to try to foster changes on the ground, if you will. And on the risk management side, very similarly, these materiality assessments are more in place, and we see that institutions are really deep diving on specific areas of risks where they think they are exposed, but we're still missing, if you will, the overall comprehensive picture. And I think that's also what we'll get to in a moment, where there's a bit of a need, if you will, for a clear roadmap, but I'll get to that.
It seems something that we keep on hearing, that the power is with investors, exclusions, how effective they are. I'm interested to hear how much leverage investors have in their engagement activities, in their stewardship, because this is a topic that keeps returning, but and it was started years ago. So interested to hear from your perspective, what are the key challenges for you, and what are the key trends?
I'll maybe start with giving you the answer to your question, and I'm going to go back to regulation and policymakers, because that's the key, but I can elaborate about this. Look, in terms of trends, I think we are definitely on a very positive trajectory. If I think back to 2021, when we were preparing a year ahead of Montreal, there was a handful of financial institutions. I probably spent 3 years explaining to people what biodiversity is. And, we came to Montreal and there were over 10,000 people in attendance. Cali was 20,000. And what was positive about Cali, despite some of the shortcomings of the whole of the COP, is that there were 20,000 people in attendance, and for the first time we had representation from Ministry of Finance. And nature is something that has been largely seen, this is the issue of environmental ministries, but it's not. If we are going to resolve this, you need a whole government approach, and it was great to see, actually, I attended a breakfast with 20 finance ministers, and it was, great to see that there is definitely action happening there. In terms of the corporates and what's going on there, I think there are two things to consider. One is the reporting requirements, and the second one is the lack of global regulation to actually allow the corporates to report, especially when it comes to CSRD and the number of KPIs that are requested. And I'll give you a great example also, in terms of banking, the way that we see investments should drive systems resilience, but it's very difficult to achieve this if you think that, out of the European budget, 38% of the budget is going on to subsidies. And for agricultural companies in particular, if they're getting all the subsidies, it's difficult to see how banks will not lend to them and see this as systems resiliency if the policymakers are actually giving the money. So there is definitely a lack of coordination in that respect. With regards to corporates themselves and the engagement, one can say it's very easy to say it's business as usual because the policy has not followed. But given the severity and the increasing frequency of natural disasters, corporates are waking up because they're feeling the direct effects on that. And corporates are actually taking this pretty seriously. What Emily was saying, we were actually an early adopter of TNFD. 502 adopters, it's a great result, but even those that are not adopting the TNFD are starting to look at their impact and dependency. I think what needs to happen is, in terms of the policy, we have to start internalizing externalities, and policymakers need to make the point that exploitation of nature or people, for that matter, should not be seen as a winning business model. And I think this would be, a game changer.
A very nice way of linking the topic of focusing on nature-related risks and preserving nature alongside the social aspect of it. So unless we recognize the socio-ecological imperatives here, we will see continuation of the type of counterproductive subsidies that you just mentioned. So I'm turning to you, Giovanni, from your perspective, and I know you're focused on environment. Interested to hear of what coordination you're doing within the EU and perhaps with global partners to harmonize, to regulate, to advise on regulation, and perhaps, and I know it might be beyond your daily scope, but the interplay between the environmental impacts and the societal impacts there.
Yep, and thanks a lot. So, of course, I'm very happy to hear what she said, saying it's not only the responsibility of the environment department in this case, and I fully share that. But before jumping on that part on data, let me just add another obstacle that I clearly see, which is specific for biodiversity, which is the locality. The fact that biodiversity losses are not fungible. So if it happens in one place, it's not easily, let's say, refilled or exchanged in another place. And that has an impact for financial institutions because they have to look at where their exposure is. And the difference is from one region to another, from one country to another, from one continent to another, is very much significant. I mean, just to go back to my earlier study, we had some cases on the most exposed sectors at the EU level, which are real estate, healthcare, and agriculture. But of course, that changes a lot depending on the context and on the geographical location where you do your assessment. Now, if I turn to the data issue, yes, this is the biggest challenge. I think it's not secret. It's no doubt about that. And now I turn to her again, saying I think the financial sector has a huge and a clear role to play in helping companies to develop and to come up with this data. So what we did in the last 5 years at the EU level is all the different regulatory initiatives under the sustainable finance agenda. So we had reporting and disclosures initiatives for companies, for financial entities. We came up with this classification system, the EU taxonomy, with a lot of criteria on how to assess the different activities. And by the way, there are now activities giving substantial contribution to biodiversity now into the taxonomy. So yes, we know there is a problem, and we hope still that with these new regulations coming into force and picking up, there will be more data coming up at the level of financial institutions to fulfill their assessments. But at the same time, what we understand is that there is already enough information available to start, at least with an assessment, to start initially with some conclusion, and to start feeding that into this decision-making process. So we can make the parallelism with the climate, and we will do probably coming later as well. But we saw banks are now getting used to incorporate their carbon and climate assessment into their decision-making process. I think they can start now also looking at biodiversity in that respect. Thanks.
Thank you. And moving to Gábor, you're sitting in between the UNEP-FI and involved with the investors. From your position, what do you see key trends and key challenges?
Well, I think there are a lot of challenges also in Hungary, but also probably in all regions. Maybe let me highlight two of them, and some of them has been partly mentioned, but I really want to emphasize the problems with KPIs, with biodiversity. So with climate, I think, and this is not to say that, let's say, working and starting to work with climate for banks was easy, but at least we really had greenhouse gas emissions as the single one KPI above all. And that makes things really tangible, quantifiable. For instance, carbon accounting, like measuring the finance emissions of banks. Who would have really thought 5 years ago in Hungary that this is something possible even for Hungarian banks? They can calculate it, but how do you calculate, I say, the finance biodiversity footprint of banks? And of course, there are some methodologies being evolving, but it's absolutely really complex, and also like setting targets. UNEP-FI believes in science-based target setting for climate, and I know that there are, let's say, many NGOs skeptical about climate targets set by banks, that they are not ambitious enough. There are methodological questions, but at least we do have climate targets, and also Hungarian banks have increasingly climate targets, and they are much better than having nothing. But setting biodiversity targets, absolutely very difficult for banks. So the kind of, let's say, preliminary targets we are seeing is like, okay, it's more like commitment, stopping financing of deforestation, but then we really have to go down the value chain. So again, new questions arise, or engaging, I don't know, X percentage of my clients in this year about biodiversity. So that's a client engagement target. You can quantify it, but it's not really something comparable to a greenhouse gas target. Which is much more impactful. So that's number one, the problem of KPIs, which is really very important, and don't really know how we can tackle it, especially in the short term. And my second point is really this, what we can maybe call climate fatigue. I think, again, we have to appreciate, and there are some Hungarian commercial bankers here who I think really did, a great job in recent years. Had put in a lot of effort to build up basically new methodologies, again, measuring finance emissions, working on targets, creating new green loans, I don't know, for renovating real estate, all this stuff. And it took a lot of resources. All these sustainability colleagues in commercial banks need to compete for resources internally, and now they need to go back to their boards. Now I also need resources for the biodiversity, we need extra FTEs and all this. And even with climate, we are still struggling. So even though it's really compelling now to go ahead with biodiversity, this is something absolutely important, but already with climate, I think a lot of colleagues who might be in the room or outside this room might very well feel a little bit like fatigue, and we just need a little bit more energy from somewhere.
Fair enough. And what I hear from the panelists, and really turning to the audience, that we do have an opportunity to ask questions. So if you turn to the Slido QR code, then feel free to send us questions. But we hear that there is a big data gap. So there is a methodology gap. But also you're saying the data is there. You just need to somehow find it, or is it usable? And I also hear that we do have something to start with. So perhaps we can hear a little bit about, on the positive note, do you see any good practices from where you're in the driver's seat in many different positions? So any good practices that we can hear about that can be used for upscaling? Yeah, so that's the criteria I'm looking for. Thank you.
All right, thanks a lot. And as I mentioned, we published some early good practices in 22, and we'll come with more next year. But maybe there's several. So we saw institutions do a lot in the space of client engagement, sector policies, and so on. But on the positive front, we also observed at least one institution that did set a biodiversity net positive target by 2030, if I remember correctly, and also, framing clear KPIs for various business lines and so on. So apparently it is possible to do it, but this is certainly not something that indeed we're seeing across the board just yet. And maybe that also, if you allow me to briefly respond to that, because I think I can very much acknowledge the challenge, and I think to be able to do that properly, I think we can also learn from what we have seen in the climate space, right? So if I look at how institutions generally use or develop strategy setting procedures, this builds a lot on the concept of alignment, right? So if you look at the climate disclosure regime, right? You need to publish where you stand today, right? Financed emissions, backward looking. You need to publish your green asset ratio, right? So how many of your clients essentially have already met the mark? But of course, there's a very big gap, and that's where the majority of the assets is, and that's also, I think, the point that you were making earlier, that still have to move from A to B. And the question is, are they moving at the right pace, right? And for that, we have, of course, alignment metrics to be disclosed that essentially make use of decarbonization pathways that set out in a time-bound manner how do different actors in different sectors and different geographies have to move, right? So how fast does the deployment of wind and solar need to be in a particular geography, and how fast is the phasing out of coal-fired power stations need to be, right? So we have kind of that trajectory, and I think that's really the part that is missing, if you will, in the nature-related space that really gives us a concrete context-based target to measure against that would help us also orient these sector policies and these client engagement strategies to try to get, if you will, the big client base into the right directives. So I think also in that sense we can learn a lot from what we see in climate that is just ahead, if you will.
Thank you. Ingrid, I'm sure you have some good upscaling examples to share with us.
Yeah, perhaps the major one is to stop this siloing between climate and biodiversity, because climate change is only one of the 5 drivers of biodiversity loss. So those two should be integrated, and what a lot of finance industry is hoping for, that we will actually see the merger between TCFD and TNFD, which would help resolve this issue. Second thing on the metrics, it's a great excuse. There are no metrics and it's so complicated. It's complicated if you want to look at, a particular species of butterfly somewhere on the top of a mountain, but the way that this should be dealt with by financial institutions is to look at where are the biggest stresses on our ecosystems coming from, and they're coming from water, and the way that water is being withdrawn, as well as, hazardous chemicals pollution, waste, deforestation. 80% of all of the deforestation is due to commercial agriculture, and then obviously the emissions that everybody's looking at. We actually developed a proprietary biodiversity impact database, and apart from those 4 main KPIs that we believe every company should be able to report on already and should be taking into account, we are also looking at food waste, because 40% of all the food that we eat ends as waste. And, we could resolve, if that is being tackled in a proper manner, I think we would definitely reduce the stresses both on biodiversity and climate change. And the second one is obviously deforestation. What is a company doing in terms of the way that they approach the land use? And with Natural History Museum, they have developed something called the Biodiversity Intactness Index, and this was only used within the scientific circle tackles, and it's the biggest collection of biodiversity in the world. They have a sample size of 50,000 species across animals, plants, insects, and fungi that they have mapped in 100 locations globally. 58,000 locations in 100 countries globally, and you can actually make predictive models with that. And by looking at BII, you get a good sense of whether a company is operating in a biodiversity fragile area. And today, this is available on Bloomberg. Bloomberg is the most used data tool for financial institutions, and you can analyze corporates by just putting, ESG nature, and you will get this data. So the data is there.
Yeah, I will jump in then. No, I agree with the colleagues who just spoke. I mean, the one good trend that we see is that there is this systemic approach that is being taken into consideration. So we do not see biodiversity in isolation, but we try to see how it interacts. So we see all the different frameworks and models which have been proposed and discussed. They take into consideration also the contagion effects that biodiversity losses have on the whole economy, how the economic factors are impacted by all the transitional risks, including political developments, value chains, legal risks, and so on, and how the financial system can have a systemic role in case of biodiversity losses. So we really much appreciate that there is this trend ongoing to have an overall comprehensive approach on the topic. What we see that is still needed, but still we're on a good hope, is that there is a common terminology and there are common definitions. So we think there is the need to have an alignment between how the companies speak and report, how the financial institutions can report and assess their risks, and how the supervisors address them and interact with them. We think that it's getting there, but we are not there yet. And of course, the international dimension has a big role to play. From the EU side, we can do what we can do, but we need to mobilize everybody in that direction. Maybe the last point I want to mention also in this is that at least when we discuss these frameworks, biodiversity is intended in a broader sense. So it also includes water, because we heard and we now see water as a very important footprint and a very important factor in all different sectors. So it's important to include water in the biodiversity assessments.
Thank you. And just to summarize what I'm hearing and to turn to you, Gábor, on looking for existing good practices that can be upscaled, we're hearing that there is acknowledgement that systemic level solutions are required, breaking silos between climate biodiversity and, I might add, between the disciplines. So now that we're talking with natural scientists and social scientists together, I think this is also a step in that direction. So perhaps you can give us your perspective, Gábor.
Sure. Maybe just also want to echo that convergence with methodologies are very important. And in the video recording, we heard about the TNFD framework and the LEAP approach. And actually, these are out there. These are not perfect, but actually freely available for everybody to use, and this is already a good step forward. But looking also for other kinds of, let's say, solutions, if I can call them like that. Maybe let me also a little bit touch upon water, which was already mentioned in our panel. If one takes the time to read the OECD's report, which was produced for Hungary about the Hungarian financial system's exposure to nature-related risks, one very alarming message is the Hungarian economy's reliance on water. And of course, one can wonder, okay, so as a bank, what can I do? These clients, maybe, for instance, companies active in agriculture, they're exposed to water risk. Of course, if I pull out the financing from these clients, that won't really help anybody. Maybe it might reduce my losses, but it won't really help the Hungarian economy and also Hungarian nature. So one can wonder, what can we do? Are there any solutions out there? And the good news is, that yes, there are. For instance, water conservation practices, water storage practices, sustainable agricultural practices, collecting rainfall and all these things. Some NGOs like WWF, who are also with us today, have really been advocating, for instance, these solutions. They are out there, they are experts of this topic. So even though basically the situation might be really very alarming, and it is in Hungary, also we can see it in the OECD report, but if a bank wanted to finance solutions, investments into tackling the problem, methodologies are out there from water experts, such as those working with WWF Hungary.
Then it seems that methodology is there, data is there, we just need to look in the right places. We are sitting at the central bank, and they have this great initiative of supporting academic research in green finance. Let me turn to you to ask you maybe a bit cheeky question. What new research questions would you like to hear from the academic community? Probably the young researchers who are applying for the finance research grant offered by the central bank to support your work.
You want me to start again?
I was
hoping this time you would start on the other side of the table.
It's an open question.
No, I think for me, I would just reiterate the point that on the development of these pathways, right, sector-specific pathways, how can we actually get to that point of a nature-positive economy? So put differently, if you look at the global biodiversity framework, the national biodiversity strategies and so on, and then sector-specific policy initiative, if we add that all up, what does the actual trajectory look like? And does it get us where we want to be, or are further kind of actions required?
So business as usual versus path shifting, where does that take us? Okay, hope my colleagues are taking notes. Ingrid, please.
I think to Juan's point, on a local level in terms of NBSAPs, I think that's important in terms of research to be done, because if you look on a global level, we have plenty of research in terms of, you know, the impacts and dependencies, but to have effective NBSAPs, you should be doing more local research to really develop proper planning.
And perhaps you could give some color on NBSAPs for those who are not aware.
So those are the national biodiversity strategy plans that were agreed to be developed during COP15 in Montreal. Only 44 out of 194 countries have submitted them so far. There are more countries that have submitted targets, but what you really want to see is this detailed NBSAPs.
Maybe not a direct question, but where I think the researchers and the universities can help is building up and helping to develop the knowledge and the competencies which are needed in the financial sector to come up with these new, let's say, assessments and exercises. I very much hear what you said about this fatigue. Yes, still, we think there is still a huge opportunity now to bring basically the sector up to speed compared to the climate sector, and there is the need to develop the competencies to assess these risks.
Quickly, one partly research and partly policy question. So how can we create a well-functioning market for biodiversity credits? Which is, again, a very interesting topic. I've seen at least 2 biodiversity credit experts here, so please go and find them, because I think this is absolutely very important and very promising, but we really need good policies and also good research, let's say, backing biodiversity credit markets, which will be developed in Europe and maybe also outside Europe in the near future.
Gábor, we wrote 60 pages on biodiversity measurement as a part of the International Advisory Panel, and all of these working papers are available online. So there is a lot of research for those who are interested. We published all of the working papers on the demand, the supply, the governance, and the measurement.
So this brings me to some questions that we've heard from the audience, and I think it links to what you're saying, is that the research is out there. How impactful is it? How is it reaching the market players? And more specifically, the question we received is, yes, in the climate space, is there a reasonable probability to transition risks to realize in the future, to realize in the future by more stringent policy regulation? Is there something similar for nature? And it's up to any of the panelists who would like to take the question.
Shall I start again? Okay, but please help, colleagues. So, no, I think it's a very important question, right? And it ties in a lot to the question of materiality, right? So, and we expect that banks assess materiality of their exposures to the risk, both for climate and environment. And what we've seen in the past years is the longer we look at it, the higher the scores are, if you will. So when we started looking at this in 2021, I believe 50% of the institutions saw climate nature risk hitting them somewhere. In 2022, that was 85%, 2023, 90%, and 2024 we'll have to see early next year. So we clearly see an increase, right? And that is also there for nature-related risk, albeit lower. And if you look at some of the early studies that have been done, so there are of course a lot of discussions in the policy space on the polluter pays principle, right? And we know of course what the impact is on financial stability, on individual financial institutions if we were to price CO2s at given levels, right? A lot of stress tests have been done in that regard. Interestingly so, if you look at the early work, if you even only price air, water, and land pollutants and then look at the impact of profitability on the firms, we get very similar results, right? So the materiality is clearly there, right? And I think I'll leave it to the other colleagues to comment on the likelihood of us implementing all of the envisioned policies.
I think what's important is, if you think about the financial industry and the global money flows, those are global, but regulations are not. And EU has obviously been at the forefront with great regulations such as the EUDR, the CSDDD. But the issue is if we don't have a global adoption of at least similar type of regulations, we are not going to get far, because what will happen is just a creation of dual markets where at the end of the day, the European companies are going to lose out.
I will try with a short and diplomatic answer in the sense that it's very early now in the process because you have the hearings of the commissioners in these days. So the new commission will come by the end of the year. So we still have to understand exactly the priorities for new rules coming up. What I can say is that several of the rules which have been developed in the past years are under review or will start to be reviewed. But at the same time, there were some commitments on reducing the reporting burden of non-financial disclosure and reporting. So we have to see how the balance will go through. Of course, the main message is that reporting alone is not enough, but we have to see how it will materialize in practice.
Shall we take also the other questions there?
We can take another question, and the reason we might be looking bewildered is that the questions kept shifting and jumping, so we're trying to dynamically adapt to this question. But the next question that we received was, given the backdrop of the US elections results, and let me bring a slight reminder of this year's Nobel Prize winner for economics. I think the message there was that nothing can be achieved unless you have politics as an ally. So with this backdrop, where do you see the next steps? Who do we expect to have the next move if this is a chess table?
Let me start. So I will not comment on the US election. Make it simple. I can say what Europe committed to do. And it's clear from the guidelines from the president that the objectives of the Green Deal are there to stay. So there is a clear trajectory there where we want to go. How we will achieve and how we will move forward with the regulation, as I mentioned before, is still to be seen. But the objectives and the direction is fixed, and it's there to stay.
Any closing remarks? Any key messages that we want to contribute to?
I think in a similar vein, I also don't pretend to have the wisdom to understand exactly what the impact of the outcome of the elections today was, but I think it's also important to acknowledge there that, if we look at, and I think it will apply to a lot of people in the room as well, financial institutions themselves and banks in my context in particular, there's a very broad acknowledgement of the material impacts of nature-related risks on themselves, right? So in that they already, out of their own volition, of course, reacted that as responsible risk managers, if you will. Similarly, if you look at their strategy setting, there's an increasing number of institutions that also want to contribute, and I would imagine them to continue doing so.
And maybe the last question that we got, and I think that's very relevant for you, Ingrid and Gábor, what would you advise stakeholders in Hungary who are at the beginning of their steps?
I think the first thing is just start looking at your impacts and dependencies on nature. You could use the ANCHOR framework in terms of the sector exposure and the LEAP framework from TNFD. Don't set big ambitions, look at your business and really try to assess the impacts and dependencies. And you can use this data for free, and it's out there. It's doable.
It's available in open science, indeed. Yeah.
My take on this one, well, maybe use the lunch break wisely. And what makes me say that? Again, a lot of experts here in the audience. Also in the panel, Helena was very, very modest and haven't really talked about her research center that she runs at University of Cornelius. But Helena's team has done a lot of research on biodiversity-related financial risks. So again, Helena is one of the examples if you can stay for the lunch break, you can approach. And if you are really just starting off your nature journey, Helena and also other colleagues are here to really start cooperating with. So that would be probably my recommendation.
Thank you very much for highlighting that we are doing efforts in bringing biodiversity finance as a standalone discipline. And with that, I thank the panelists for joining me today, and hopefully this was an eye-opener, and we finish on a positive note that we do have some tools at hand, and we do see some good examples. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, dear panelists, for this meaningful conversation.